The moment when the identical triplets walk onto the stage beside their mother and the CEO freezes upon seeing 3 pairs of blue eyes identical to his own, the truth he discovered too late. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. New York City, 2008. Gabriella Johnson's slender fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the silverware on the dining table for the 3rd time. The crystal glasses caught the fading evening light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Michael Harrison's Central Park penthouse. She stepped back, surveying her work, the table settings perfect, candles waiting to be lit, Michael's favorite wine breathing in the decanter. Her hand instinctively moved to her pocket, touching the plastic pregnancy test she'd hidden there, its 2 pink lines still seeming impossible despite the 5 tests she'd taken over 2 days. 23 years old, a recent Yale graduate with honors, and now unexpectedly pregnant. 6 months ago, this would have terrified her. Today, living in this luxury apartment as Michael Harrison's fiancée, she allowed herself to hope this news might be welcomed. The sound of keys in the door made her heart jump. She smoothed her dress, a simple black number she'd splurged on last month, and touched the elegant engagement ring that had adorned her finger for 8 months. "Michael, I made dinner," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael Harrison strode in, phone pressed to his ear, his tailored suit still immaculate after a full day at Harrison Enterprises. At 31, he commanded attention. Tall, with chiseled features, and those striking blue eyes that had made her weak-kneed the first time they'd met in a Yale economics seminar. "I'll need those reports by morning, James. The Japanese investors won't wait," he said sharply into the phone before ending the call. He barely glanced at the table. "You didn't have to cook. I could have had something sent up." "I wanted to," Gabriella smiled. "It's a special night." Michael loosened his tie, pouring himself a whiskey without offering her one. "Special how? Did you hear back about that entry-level position at Goldman?" "Not yet." She lit the candles, trying to create the warmth this steel and glass apartment often lacked. "Let's eat first." Throughout the appetizer, Michael discussed market fluctuations and the growing financial crisis. Gabriella nodded, offering insights from her economic theory background that he acknowledged with brief nods. She'd learned that Michael valued her intelligence. It was what had drawn him to her in that Yale classroom, the scholarship girl from Harlem whose analysis had impressed even the teaching assistant. By the main course, she'd gathered her courage. As Michael cut into his steak, she reached across the table to touch his hand. "Michael, I have wonderful news." Her heart hammered as she smiled. "We're pregnant." His hand froze mid-cut. The blue eyes that had melted with desire so many times now turned glacial as they fixed on her face. He set his knife down with deliberate care. "Pregnant?" His voice was measured, each syllable precise. "And you expect me to do what exactly?" He swirled the expensive whiskey in his glass, studying the amber liquid. Confusion flickered across Gabriella's face. I thought we'd be happy. Start the family we talked about." The laugh that escaped Michael's lips cut through the air like a blade. Harsh, dismissive, devoid of warmth. "Family? Gabriella, be realistic." He leaned back, appraising her as he might a disappointing investment. "A pregnant black wife would be a burden to my corporate image. You never belonged in my world. This was entertaining. But my future requires someone who can navigate Manhattan high society, not a girl from Harlem." Each word struck Gabriella like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt as her dream collapsed around her. "But you said you loved me," she whispered, her voice small. "You proposed to me." "My parents warned me," Michael continued, merciless. "They said you were just an opportunist trying to climb socially. Intelligent, yes, but too common, unsuitable for circles that truly matter." Gabriella's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Your parents have never even met me. They didn't need to. They recognized what you were from the photographs, from your background. His voice hardened. They were right. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city below. Gabriella stared at the man she'd thought would be the father of her children, searching for any trace of the person she'd fallen in love with. "What are you saying?" she finally asked, though she already knew. Michael reached across the table, his fingers cold as they closed around her left hand. With clinical precision, he removed the engagement ring from her finger, the diamond catching the candlelight one last time before he tossed it onto the marble floor. The metallic tinkle echoed through the silent apartment. He stood, walking to his desk where he pulled out his checkbook. The scratch of his pen was obscenely loud in the stillness. He pushed the signed check across the table. "This should be sufficient to handle the problem. I don't mean to be indelicate, but I'll need you gone by tomorrow. I have an important dinner with Japanese investors." Gabriella stared at the check, nausea rising in her throat. "You think I want your money?" "Everyone wants money, Gabriella." His voice was tired now, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "It's the only language that matters in this city." The next few hours passed in a blur. Gabriella moved mechanically, packing her personal belongings into a single suitcase. She left her books, her framed degree, anything that wouldn't fit. Michael retreated to his home office, the light under the door the only sign of his presence as she moved through what had been their shared space. By midnight, she stood in the marble foyer, her coat buttoned against the October chill, one suitcase beside her. Michael appeared briefly, not to say goodbye, but to remind her to leave her key. "I wish you well, Gabriella," he said with businesslike finality. "You're an intelligent woman. You'll land on your feet." She left the check on the side table, untouched. Outside, a fine rain had begun to fall. Gabriella stood on the sidewalk, the reality of her situation finally breaking through her shock. 8 months ago, she had moved from her tiny student apartment into this penthouse believing in a fairy tale. Now she was alone, pregnant, with only $70 in her pocket and a Yale degree that suddenly seemed worthless in a city buckling under financial crisis. A taxi drove past, the driver briefly making eye contact before speeding away, ignoring her outstretched hand. She clutched her stomach, the first protective gesture toward the life growing inside her. "We don't need him," she whispered fiercely, though her voice broke on the last word. The next weeks were brutal. The financial collapse that had been theoretical in Michael's business discussions became painfully real as Gabriella sought work. Shelters were overcrowded with newly homeless families. After 5 nights sleeping in train stations, she managed to secure a tiny room in the Bronx, paying 3 months' rent up front with most of her remaining money. Each morning she worked as a waitress, memorizing menu items through waves of morning sickness. Afternoons, she answered phones at a small law office. Nights, she typed reports for a data entry service. Between shifts, she applied for positions matching her qualifications, watching eyes drift to her gradually swelling belly before rejection came in polite corporate phrases. In her 5th month at a crowded public clinic, Gabriella received news that should have been celebrated with a loving partner. "Well, that explains the accelerated growth," the tired doctor said, studying the ultrasound. "You're carrying triplets, Ms. Johnson." That night, in her tiny room with water stains mapping the ceiling, Gabriella placed her hands on her prominent belly. "He's wrong about everything," she whispered to her babies. "About me, about you, about who we can be." The turning point came after a double shift, when exhaustion had seeped into her bones. On the restaurant's small TV, Michael appeared in an interview, his face impeccable, discussing how Harrison Enterprises was heroically weathering the financial crisis. No trace of worry or remorse shadowed his features. Something ignited in Gabriella that night, a fierce determination that burned away the last vestiges of heartbreak. Using her final savings, she purchased a used laptop and began developing the algorithm she'd conceptualized during her Yale research. an ethical AI system her professors had dismissed as too ambitious. Working through the night between jobs and prenatal visits, she refined her vision, fueled by a promise made to herself in the cracked mirror of a communal bathroom. One day, she vowed to her reflection, "You'll look at me, at our children, and realize that the biggest mistake of your life was believing we weren't enough." While the blue lights of Manhattan twinkled above her, Gabriella couldn't imagine that 15 years later she would be looking down from those towers, owner not just of her destiny, but of an empire that would make Harrison Enterprises seem small by comparison. The same TV that showed Michael's flawless face, speaking of sacrifices he never made, would one day show her face announcing an innovation that would transform the technology world, and on that day, she would make sure he was watching. Gabriella stood frozen before the small television mounted in the corner of the diner, her serving tray clutched against her chest like a shield. Michael's face filled the screen, the perfect Windsor knot of his tie and the precise part of his dark hair unchanged since she'd last seen him 3 months ago. The financial crisis that had rendered her homeless was merely a talking point for him, an opportunity to showcase his business acumen. "Harrison Enterprises remains solid amid market turbulence," he was saying, blue eyes projecting sincerity to the camera. "While others panic, we've maintained our composure and protected our clients' interests." A bitter laugh escaped Gabriella's lips. Composure. As if he knew anything about maintaining composure while your world collapsed. "Johnson, table 7 still waiting on their order." The manager's sharp voice broke her trance. She hurried back to work, ignoring the cramping in her lower back, a persistent reminder of the 12-hour shift she'd already completed. Her swollen ankles protested with each step as she delivered plates of greasy food to impatient customers who barely acknowledged her presence. That night, Gabriella huddled in her bed, a threadbare blanket pulled up to her chin. The room in the Bronx was barely bigger than a closet, with a ceiling stained from water leaks and walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television as clearly as if it were in the room with her. The shared bathroom down the hall meant midnight trips through a dimly lit corridor that smelled of mildew and cheap disinfectant. She placed both hands on her expanding belly, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her palms. The triplets were active tonight. "What am I going to do?" she whispered into the darkness. Her Yale degree hung in a cheap frame on the wall, the prestigious name now seeming like a cruel joke. What good was an Ivy League education when no one would hire a visibly pregnant woman? Sleep eluded her, replaced by Michael's face on that television screen, talking about resilience while she scrubbed food from plates and counted pennies for prenatal vitamins. The next morning arrived with merciless swiftness. Gabriella dragged herself to the bathroom, wincing at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her once glossy hair hung limp around her face. She smoothed her waitress uniform over her 20-week belly, now impossible to conceal. "I need this job," she reminded herself, applying a touch of drugstore lipstick in a futile attempt to look less exhausted. The diner was busy with the breakfast rush when she arrived. For 6 hours she smiled through nausea, memorized orders despite fatigue-induced brain fog, and endured the pitying glances of co-workers who had witnessed her vomiting in the employee restroom between tables. By 2 o'clock, she was at her second job, answering phones at a small law office. The receptionist position had been a rare stroke of luck. The elderly owner didn't care about her pregnancy as long as she answered calls professionally. "Johnson Law Offices. How may I direct your call?" Her voice transformed here, becoming the polished tone she'd cultivated at Yale. No one would guess that the same woman had spent the morning refilling coffee cups for minimum wage. At 7, she began her third job as a data entry clerk, typing financial reports until midnight. The irony wasn't lost on her, inputting profit margins for the very financial institutions that wouldn't hire her. Days blurred together in this punishing routine. Each evening, she returned to her tiny room, feet throbbing, back aching, to collapse onto the narrow bed. On her one day off each week, She attended prenatal appointments at a clinic where overworked doctors barely remembered her name from visit to visit. "Ms. Johnson?" A nurse called her from the crowded waiting room. "Doctor will see you now." The examination room was cold, the paper gown thin against her skin. The ultrasound machine hummed in the corner, a reminder of the last time she'd seen her babies, when she'd learned there were 3 of them. Dr. Chen entered, clipboard in hand, her white coat wrinkled from a long day. "How are you feeling, Ms. Johnson?" "Tired," Gabriella admitted, "but managing." The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your blood pressure's elevated. Are you getting enough rest? Proper nutrition?" Gabriella nodded automatically, the lie necessary. How could she explain that rest was a luxury she couldn't afford, that proper nutrition meant whatever she could buy with what remained after rent? The cold gel on her abdomen made her flinch. Dr. Chen moved the ultrasound wand with practiced efficiency, and suddenly the room filled with rapid heartbeats, 3 distinct rhythms joining in magnificent chaos. "Your babies are smaller than I'd like," Dr. Chen said, pointing to the screen where 3 tiny forms floated in their separate sacs. "Are you eating regularly?" "Yes," Gabriella lied again, "as much as I can." The doctor's expression remained skeptical. "You need more calories with triplets. More rest, too. You're at high risk for premature labor." Walking home from the clinic, Gabriella stopped at a grocery store, carefully counting dollars for the most nutritious food she could afford. Rice, beans, frozen vegetables, eggs, stretching every penny while remembering the casual ease with which Michael had once ordered $100 bottles of wine. In her room that night, eating rice and beans from a plastic container, she watched raindrops race down her small window. The sound of someone arguing in the next room provided unwanted accompaniment to her solitary dinner. Suddenly, something inside her shifted, not the babies moving, but something deeper. She looked at her reflection in the window glass, barely visible against the night sky. "This isn't who I am," she said aloud. She opened her laptop, purchased with 2 weeks' savings from a pawn shop, and pulled up the algorithm she'd begun developing at Yale. Her senior project had focused on ethical artificial intelligence applications, creating systems that could predict market fluctuations while prioritizing humanitarian concerns over pure profit. Her professors had called it impractically idealistic, but she'd seen its potential. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, recalling complex coding patterns. For the first time in months, her mind felt fully engaged, the creative spark reigniting. Hour after hour, she refined formulas, built frameworks, solved problems that had once seemed insurmountable. Dawn found her still working, back aching but mind alive. She saved her progress, closed the laptop, and prepared for another day of endless service with new purpose in her heart. Weeks passed. The routine remained brutal. Waitressing, answering phones, data entry, but nights transformed into sessions of creation. On her laptop, a new world emerged, one where technology served humanity rather than exploiting it. One Wednesday evening, exhausted after a double shift covering for a sick coworker, Gabriella noticed a small library still lit up despite the late hour. A sign in the window read, "Open until 10 p.m. on Wednesdays." Drawn by the promise of quiet and warmth, she stepped inside. The library was nearly empty, shelves of books creating a sanctuary of knowledge. She found a corner table and opened her laptop, losing herself in code until a gentle voice interrupted. "Excuse me, dear, we're closing." Gabriella looked up to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm sorry," Gabriella began gathering her things, embarrassed to find she'd fallen asleep on her keyboard. The woman, Eleanor Davis, according to her name tag, glanced at the screen. "Programming? That looks advanced." "It's an algorithm for ethical artificial intelligence," Gabriella explained automatically, too tired to simplify. To her surprise, Eleanor nodded with understanding. "Fascinating field. My daughter Maya teaches technology entrepreneurship at NYU." Gabriella's hands stilled on her laptop. Really? Eleanor studied the young woman before her, pregnant, exhausted, yet working on complex programming at 9:30 at night. You know, we have a small room in the back with better Wi-Fi. No one uses it much. You're welcome to work there until I close up. That night marked the beginning of a vital friendship. The small back room of the library became Gabriella's sanctuary, a place where Eleanor would bring her tea and occasionally scan through her work with surprisingly insightful comments. "My late husband was a computer scientist," she explained when Gabriella expressed surprise at her technical knowledge. "I picked up quite a bit over 40 years of marriage." 2 weeks later, Eleanor placed a business card on the table beside Gabriella's laptop. "My daughter Maya is hosting an entrepreneurship seminar next month. I think you should go." Gabriella stared at the small card in her hand. Dr. Maya Davis, NYU School of Business. "Eleanor, I can't just—" "You can and you will," the older woman interrupted firmly. "I've seen what you're building. It's extraordinary." That night, standing at the bus stop after the library closed, Gabriella looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the blue lights of skyscrapers piercing the darkness. For the first time since Michael had thrown her out, those lights didn't seem like distant, unattainable stars, but beacons guiding her toward a future she was beginning to believe in. The small card with Dr. Maya Davis's name seemed insignificant in her hand, but it would be the first brick of a bridge that would lead Gabriella from a room in the Bronx to the leadership of a technological revolution the world didn't yet know it needed. The small card with Dr. Maya Davis's name seemed insignificant in her hand, but it would be the first brick of a bridge that would lead Gabriella from a room in the Bronx to the leadership of a technological revolution the world didn't yet know it needed. That night, Gabriella made a decision. With trembling fingers, she counted the money she had been saving for an emergency, $237, tucked into an envelope beneath her mattress. Tomorrow, she would use the last of it to buy something essential, not for her babies, but for her future. Their future. The electronics shop on Fordham Road was dingy, fluorescent lights flickering overhead as Gabriella examined the used laptops. Most were well beyond her budget, screens cracked or keys missing. "Can I help you find something?" A young man with a name tag reading Devon approached her. Gabriella rested a hand on her prominent belly. "I need a computer, something that can handle programming. This is all I have." She showed him the folded bills. Devon frowned, scanning the inventory. "Not much here for that price, but—" He disappeared into a back room, returning with a battered black laptop. "This one's not pretty, but the processor's decent. Previous owner upgraded the RAM before he pawned it." He plugged it in, the screen illuminating with a tired glow. "It won't win any beauty contests, but it should run basic programming software." Gabriella tested the keyboard, relief washing over her when all the keys responded. "I'll take it." Back in her apartment, she set up her workstation, the laptop on a wobbly table, her single chair positioned to ease the strain on her back. Outside, rain pelted the window as she installed the development environment she needed, using the building's unreliable shared Wi-Fi. Night after night, between exhausting shifts, Gabriella refined the algorithm she'd conceptualized at Yale. Her senior project had focused on creating an artificial intelligence system that could make financial predictions while prioritizing ethical considerations, environmental impact, labor practices, community benefit. Her professors had dismissed it as naively idealistic, but now, as the financial crisis revealed the consequences of profit-driven decision-making, her vision seemed more relevant than ever. Her coat draped over her shoulders for warmth, Gabriella worked through the code, the blue light of the screen illuminating her determined face as her babies kicked and shifted within her. The heat in the building was sporadic at best, but she barely noticed, lost in the elegant logic of her creation. During her short break at the diner the following day, Gabriella scribbled equations and flowcharts on napkins, ignoring the curious glances of her coworkers. The restaurant manager, a perpetually harried woman named Diane, caught her hunched over her notes. "Programming on napkins now?" Diane asked, eyebrow raised. Gabriella quickly covered her work. Just some ideas. Diane shook her head. Yale graduates serving pancakes and solving equations on napkins. This economy is something else. She slid a plate across the counter. Kitchen had extra. Eat something. Gabriella accepted the food gratefully, unable to remember when she'd last eaten a full meal. The babies were taking everything she had. At her next prenatal appointment, Dr. Chen's concern was unmistakable as she measured Gabriella's belly and examined the ultrasound. "Your triplets are measuring smaller than I'd like to see at this stage," she said, frowning at the monitor where 3 distinct forms floated. "Are you eating adequately, Ms. Johnson?" "Yes," Gabriella lied. The single meal a day she allowed herself hardly qualifying as adequate nutrition for 4. "I'm eating well." Dr. Chen's expression made it clear she didn't believe her. "Multiple pregnancies require significantly more calories and rest. Your blood pressure is elevated and you're showing early signs of anemia. I'm prescribing prenatal vitamins with iron and recommending bed rest." The suggestion of bed rest struck Gabriella as darkly humorous. Bed rest was a luxury for women with partners, with savings, with support systems, not for abandoned mothers-to-be working 3 jobs. That night, back in her room, Gabriella stared at her algorithm failing for the 5th time in a row. The complex calculations that had seemed so elegant in theory kept collapsing when applied to real-world data. Tears of frustration streamed down her face as she rested her head on the keyboard, her 26-week belly pressing uncomfortably against the table edge. "I can't do this," she whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting. A single mother of triplets creating a revolutionary algorithm from a decaying apartment with a second-hand laptop? The absurdity of it struck her fully for the first time. The next evening, nearly dead on her feet after covering an extra shift, Gabriella noticed a small library still lit up despite the late hour. Drawn by the promise of reliable Wi-Fi and warmth, she stepped inside, finding a quiet corner to work. Hours passed as she lost herself in code, the familiar rhythm of programming offering an escape from her circumstances. "Excuse me," a gentle voice startled her. "We're closing now." Gabriella looked up to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. To her embarrassment, she realized she'd fallen asleep on her keyboard. "I'm so sorry." Gabriella gathered her things quickly, noticing the librarian's gaze lingering on her computer screen. "That looks like advanced programming," the woman observed, her head tilted curiously. Exhaustion lowered Gabriella's usual guardedness. "It's an ethical AI algorithm. It's supposed to predict market fluctuations while prioritizing humanitarian concerns, but the integration matrix keeps failing." Instead of the blank stare this explanation usually elicited, the librarian nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered using a Bayesian approach instead of trying to force a deterministic model?" Gabriella blinked in surprise. "You understand this?" The woman, Eleanor Davis, according to her name tag, smiled warmly. "My late husband was a computer scientist at Columbia. I picked up quite a bit over 40 years of marriage." She glanced at the clock. "I need to close up, but there's a small room in the back with better Wi-Fi. No one uses it this late. You're welcome to work there until I finish my closing duties." The back room became Gabriella's sanctuary over the following weeks. Eleanor would bring her tea and occasionally scan through her work, offering surprisingly insightful suggestions. Some nights, when Gabriella's exhaustion was evident, Eleanor would silently place a sandwich beside her laptop, prepared from her own dinner. "You don't have to feed me," Gabriella protested one evening. Eleanor's response was firm. "I have a daughter about your age. If she were pregnant and alone, I'd hope someone would look after her." As their friendship developed, Eleanor learned Gabriella's story, the prestigious degree, the callous abandonment, the determination to build something meaningful despite overwhelming odds. "My Maya would be impressed by what you're doing," Eleanor said one night, referring to her daughter. She's always looking for innovators who think beyond profit margins. Maya? Eleanor nodded proudly. Dr. Maya Davis. She teaches technology entrepreneurship at NYU, specializes in startups with social impact potential. The following evening, Eleanor placed a business card on the table beside Gabriella's laptop. Maya is hosting an entrepreneurship seminar next month. I think you should go. Gabriella stared at the small card. Eleanor, I appreciate this, but look at me. She gestured to her clearly pregnant form, her worn clothing. No one takes a pregnant woman seriously in the business world, especially not one who looks like she's about to deliver any day. Maya isn't no one, Eleanor countered, and that's precisely why you should meet her. She recognizes talent regardless of packaging. That night, as Eleanor drove her home in a rainstorm, Gabriella felt the first genuine hope since Michael had discarded her. The small card with Dr. Maya Davis's contact information rested in her pocket, a tenuous connection to a world that had seemed forever closed to her. In her apartment, Gabriella placed a protective hand over her belly as the triplets stirred restlessly. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, with more conviction than she'd felt in months. "I promise." The same TV that had shown Michael's flawless face, speaking of sacrifices he never made, would one day show her face announcing an innovation that would transform the technology world. And on that day, she would make sure he was watching. The small card with Dr. Maya Davis's contact information felt like a talisman in Gabriella's pocket as she rode the subway to NYU's business campus. At 32 weeks pregnant with triplets, her body had transformed into something nearly unrecognizable. Her belly so pronounced that people on the train had stopped meeting her eyes, as if her condition might be contagious. She wore her only presentable outfit, black maternity pants and a navy blouse she'd found at a thrift store, carefully mended where a seam had started to split. The business school building loomed before her, its glass facade reflecting the gray November sky. Students in tailored outfits bustled past, some casting curious glances at the heavily pregnant woman clutching a worn leather portfolio. Another thrift store find that concealed the shabbiness of her presentation materials. "Dr. Davis's office is on the 4th floor," the receptionist informed her, eyes lingering on Gabriella's belly. "Do you need the elevator?" Gabriella nodded gratefully. Standing for any length of time had become a challenge, the weight of the triplets straining her back and swelling her ankles to painful proportions. In the waiting area outside Dr. Maya Davis's office, Gabriella reviewed her notes one final time. The algorithm had improved dramatically with Eleanor's suggestions, though it still failed under certain conditions. She shifted uncomfortably, unable to get close enough to the edge of her seat to properly use the table. When the door opened, Dr. Maya Davis emerged. A striking woman in her mid-40s with her mother's kind eyes but a sharper, more assessing gaze. She wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Ms. Johnson?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly at the sight of Gabriella's advanced pregnancy. "Please come in." Dr. Davis's office was minimalist yet warm, with photographs of global destinations mixed with framed academic achievements. She gestured to a more comfortable chair than the one in the waiting area. "My mother has told me about your project. I must admit I was intrigued, though she failed to mention your current situation. I hope my pregnancy won't affect your assessment of my work," Gabriella said, straightening her spine despite the discomfort. A hint of respect flickered in Maya's eyes. "Of course not. I'm interested in innovation, not maternal status. Show me what you've created." For the next 40 minutes, Gabriella outlined her algorithm, explaining how traditional financial models prioritized short-term profits over sustainable growth and ethical considerations. Her system incorporated factors typically dismissed as externalities: environmental impact, labor practices, community benefit, and predicted market behavior with surprising accuracy when these were valued appropriately. As she spoke, Gabriella's fatigue melted away, replaced by the passion that had fueled her through sleepless nights. Her hands moved animatedly, illustrating complex concepts with natural grace. She was no longer a desperate, abandoned woman, but a visionary presenting a new paradigm. Maya's initial skepticism transformed gradually into genuine interest. She asked probing questions, challenged assumptions, and nodded thoughtfully at Gabriella's responses. "Your work is extraordinary," Maya finally said, leaning back in her chair. "But you clearly have other priorities imminently approaching." Her gaze moved pointedly to Gabriella's belly. "The babies won't change my commitment to this project," Gabriella insisted. Maya's expression remained non-committal. "Let me consider this. I'll be in touch within the week." 2 days later, Gabriella sat in Eleanor's library back room, inputting modifications to her code. The November rain beat against the windows as evening settled into night. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and grip the edge of the table. "Gabriella?" Eleanor looked up from her desk. "Are you all right?" "Just Braxton Hicks," Gabriella assured her, though the contractions had been increasing in frequency throughout the day. "False labor. It's common with multiples." Eleanor watched her with concern. "Maybe we should call it a night. I can drive you home." "Just let me finish this section." Gabriella turned back to her computer, determined to complete the module before leaving. 20 minutes later, another contraction hit. Stronger, unmistakable. Gabriella felt warm liquid pooling beneath her, soaking through her clothes to the chair. "Eleanor," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "My water broke." The librarian's eyes widened as she saw the puddle forming on the floor. "My God, the babies are coming." The next moments blurred into chaos. Eleanor helping her to the car, Gabriella trying not to scream as contractions intensified, the frantic drive through rain-slicked streets to the nearest hospital. 32 weeks with triplets," the emergency room nurse announced as Gabriella was wheeled in. "Call obstetrics stat." In the delivery room, monitors beeped ominously as doctors and nurses moved with controlled urgency. Gabriella lay semi-conscious, overwhelmed by pain and fear. "Third fetus showing heart rate deceleration," a doctor called out. "We need to do a C-section immediately." "Please," Gabriella gasped between contractions. "Save my babies." The anesthesiologist's mask descended over her face. "Count backward from 10, Ms. Johnson." Gabriella's world faded to black, her last conscious thought a prayer for the 3 lives depending on her survival. She drifted in and out of awareness, floating through fragments of reality, the sharp antiseptic smell, the distant sound of medical equipment, the murmur of voices. Then, cutting through it all, a sound that reached straight to her soul, a thin, indignant cry, followed by another and finally a third, the symphony of her children entering the world. When Gabriella fully regained consciousness in the recovery room, her first sensation was pain, a raw, burning ache across her abdomen where the surgical incision had been made. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, finding it dramatically smaller but tender to the touch. "My babies?" she whispered, struggling to sit up despite the pain. "Where are my babies?" A nurse appeared at her side, gently easing her back against the pillows. "Easy now. You've just had major surgery." "Please," Gabriella begged. "I need to see them." "They're in the NICU," the nurse explained. "They're very small, but they're fighters. When you're stronger, we'll take you to them." Hours later, still weak but insistent, Gabriella was wheeled to the neonatal intensive care unit. Through the glass walls, she could see 3 incubators, each containing a tiny form connected to monitors and tubes. "Here they are," the nurse said softly. "Your 2 sons and your daughter." Gabriella pressed her palm against the glass, tears streaming down her face. 3 impossibly small babies, their translucent skin revealing delicate blue veins, their eyes, when briefly open, a startling, familiar blue. Michael's eyes, looking out at a world they were not quite ready for. "They're beautiful," she whispered. The neonatologist explained their condition. Born at 32 weeks, each weighing just over 3 pounds. lungs not fully developed but responding well to treatment. They'll need to stay in the NICU for several weeks, but their prognosis is good. Eleanor arrived the following morning, carrying small, hand-knitted hats she had made through the night. "Every newborn deserves something made especially for them," she said, placing the tiny blue and pink caps beside the incubators. On the third day, as Gabriella sat beside her babies, speaking softly to them through the incubator ports, an unexpected visitor arrived. Maya Davis entered the NICU, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a manila folder. "My mother told me what happened," she said, taking in the scene. Gabriella in a hospital gown, face pale but determined, one hand reaching into each of two incubators while a nurse held the third baby against her chest for skin-to-skin contact. "I'm sorry I can't get up," Gabriella apologized. Maya shook her head. "No need." She pulled a chair closer. "I've been thinking about your project, and I have a proposal for you." She opened the folder, revealing application materials for NYU's Special Entrepreneurship Fellowship Program. It includes a modest stipend, mentorship, and flexible scheduling. Most importantly, we can adapt it for your unique situation. Meaning? Meaning you can bring your babies to campus when necessary. We have a family center with childcare services for faculty and special fellows. Gabriella stared at her, momentarily speechless. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because true innovation rarely comes from comfortable places," Maya answered simply. "And your algorithm has the potential to change how we approach technological ethics." That night, alone with her newborns, Gabriella carefully reached into each incubator, placing one finger in each tiny palm. The babies, whom she had named Aiden, Amara, and Aaron, instinctively gripped her fingers, their strength surprising for such small beings. "You three are miracles," she whispered, "and I promise you this. You will have everything you deserve in this world, everything he said we couldn't have, and one day he'll see exactly what he threw away." While cradling the triplets in her tired arms, Gabriella didn't know that the algorithmic theory she had scribbled during her pregnancy's sleepless nights would become the foundation of technology that, in 10 years, would revolutionize Wall Street, the very world Michael had so desperately wanted to shield from her. While cradling the triplets in her tired arms, Gabriella didn't know that the algorithmic theory she had scribbled during her pregnancy's sleepless nights would become the foundation of technology that, in 10 years, would revolutionize Wall Street, the very world Michael had so desperately wanted to shield from her. 3 years passed in a blur of sleepless nights, developmental milestones, and relentless work. Gabriella raced across NYU's campus, pushing a cumbersome triple stroller with one hand while clutching a stack of research papers in the other. The wheels caught on an uneven paving stone, nearly sending her materials flying. "Need a hand?" A passing professor reached out to steady the precarious tower of documents. "Thanks." Gabriella smiled gratefully, checking her watch. 3 minutes until her presentation, and Aaron had just spilled juice on his shirt. The university's subsidized family housing had been her salvation, a small 2-bedroom apartment that felt palatial compared to her former Bronx room. Eleanor visited weekly, becoming the grandmother the triplets never had, while Maya's entrepreneurship program provided the structure and support Gabriella needed to develop her algorithm from theoretical concept to functioning prototype. In the lecture hall, Gabriella settled the triplets with coloring books in the front row. At 3 years old, they were remarkably well-behaved during her presentations, though their boundless energy required constant vigilance. "As you can see," she explained to the assembled faculty and students, pointing to complex projections on the screen, traditional predictive models fail because they treat ethical considerations as externalities rather than integral components of market behavior. Professor Winters, a notoriously skeptical computer science department head, raised his hand. "Your theory is intriguing, Ms. Johnson, but without large-scale testing, it remains purely academic. The computing power required alone would be prohibitive." As if on cue, Amara toddled to the front, tugging at Gabriella's skirt. "Mama, Aaron eating crayon." Gabriella seamlessly lifted her daughter with one arm while advancing her presentation slides with the other. "Actually, Professor, we've developed a distributed processing approach that significantly reduces resource requirements. The preliminary tests show a 68% improvement over standard models." The faculty exchanged impressed glances as Gabriella gently returned Amara to her brothers, extracting a half-eaten blue crayon from Aaron's mouth without missing a beat in her technical explanation. Later that evening in their apartment, Gabriella sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by building blocks and developmental toys. Aiden, already showing remarkable mathematical intuition, arranged colored shapes in complex patterns while Amara hummed a nearly perfect rendition of Beethoven's Ode to Joy she'd heard once on the radio. Aaron, the most physically coordinated, stacked blocks higher than seemed possible for his small hands. "Mama work?" Aiden asked, pointing to her laptop. "Yes, baby. Mama needs to work a little before bedtime." She kissed his forehead, marveling at how his eyes, identical to Michael's in color, contained none of his father's coldness. After tucking the triplets into their beds, Gabriella returned to her algorithm, refining code until well past midnight. Her prototype had advanced significantly, but still struggled with certain market conditions. The theory was sound. The execution remained imperfect. Her phone rang unexpectedly, displaying Maya's number. "Gabriella, I'm sorry to call so late." Maya's voice was tense. "There's a situation at the university hospital. Their patient management system is showing anomalies, potentially misclassifying treatment protocols. Lives could be at risk." "What does this have to do with me?" "You said your algorithm could identify patterns in complex systems that conventional programs miss. This is exactly the kind of problem you've been theorizing about." 20 minutes later, Gabriella arrived at the hospital's data center, the triplets asleep on an improvised mattress in the corner, having been hastily wrapped in blankets and carried from their beds. A team of doctors and IT specialists huddled around monitors displaying patient data. "This is Ms. Johnson," Maya introduced her to the frazzled hospital administrators. "She may be able to help." The hospital's chief technology officer looked skeptically at the young woman with 3 sleeping toddlers. "We have a team of senior engineers working on this." "Let her try," interrupted the chief of medicine, desperation evident in his voice. "We've had 2 near-fatal medication errors in the last hour." Gabriella quickly integrated a version of her algorithm into the hospital system, focusing on identifying pattern anomalies. For hours, she worked, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off her screen as she searched for the source of the problem. At 3 in the morning, Aiden woke briefly, rubbing his eyes. "Mama fixing?" "Yes, sweetheart. Mama's fixing." She kissed his forehead, tucking the blanket around him before returning to her code. Dawn was breaking when she finally straightened, exhaustion and triumph battling in her expression. "I found it. The system is misinterpreting data for patients with rare genetic markers. It's assigning standard protocols to non-standard cases." The room fell silent as she displayed her findings, showing exactly how the hospital's system was failing to recognize crucial patient differences. The chief of medicine stared at the screen, then at the young woman with 3 sleeping children who had solved what his entire technical team couldn't. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "You've potentially saved lives tonight." In the weeks that followed, word of Gabriella's achievement spread through the university. Her prototype gained attention beyond academic circles, with several medical technology companies requesting demonstrations. At one such presentation, Gabriella noticed a woman sitting quietly in the back row, taking detailed notes but asking no questions. After the room cleared, the woman approached. "Catherine Chen," she introduced herself, extending a business card that identified her as the founder of Phoenix Ventures. "I'd like to discuss your work further. Are you available for lunch tomorrow?" The following day, Gabriella met Catherine at a small bistro near campus, the triplets in tow because their daycare provider had called in sick. Catherine, A sharp-featured Asian-American woman in her 50s with an air of contained energy watched with interest as Gabriella efficiently arranged 3 booster seats and distributed crayons and paper. "I apologize for bringing them," Gabriella began. "No apology necessary," Catherine waved it off. "I'm more interested in how you managed to develop such sophisticated algorithmic architecture while raising triplets alone." The lunch became an intense technical discussion, Catherine probing every aspect of Gabriella's work with incisive questions. When Amara accidentally knocked over her juice, Gabriella cleaned the spill without breaking her explanation of complex computational ethics. "Your algorithm could revolutionize how we approach predictive modeling," Catherine observed, watching Gabriella simultaneously wipe Aaron's face and correct Aiden's drawing grip. "But more impressively, you've done this under circumstances that would crush most people." As they finished dessert, which the triplets had charmed the waiter into providing complimentary, Catherine reached into her briefcase and withdrew a document. $200,000, she said, sliding the paper across the table, "for 20% of your company, assuming you plan to commercialize this technology." Gabriella stared at the figure, momentarily speechless. The sum represented more money than she'd earned in the past 3 years combined. "I do," she said finally. "Constellation Tech. That's what I'm calling it." "Constellation," Catherine repeated thoughtfully. "Stars forming patterns that guide navigation. Appropriate." 2 weeks later, Gabriella signed the investment papers with trembling hands, Catherine's check representing the first external validation of her vision. With the initial funding, she rented a small office in Brooklyn, a single room with mismatched furniture and unreliable heating, but hers entirely. On opening day, the triplets helped her hang a handmade sign on the door. Constel. Aiden struggled with the pronunciation. "Constellation Tech," Gabriella supplied, lifting him to tape their crayon-drawn logo to the glass. The childish rendering of 3 stars connected by lines would later be recreated by professional designers, but this original, smudged and imperfect, held all their hopes. On the day she opened her first tiny office, Gabriella couldn't foresee that in just 7 years, Constellation Tech would occupy an entire skyscraper in Manhattan with that same logo, now recreated by elite designers, shining from the top of the building, visible from Michael's former apartment. On the day she opened her first tiny office, Gabriella couldn't foresee that in just 7 years, Constellation Tech would occupy an entire skyscraper in Manhattan with that same logo, now recreated by elite designers, shining from the top of the building, visible from Michael's former apartment. 4 years had transformed both Gabriella and her creation. The small Brooklyn office had expanded to an entire floor in a mid-tier Manhattan office building, its minimalist decor speaking of understated success rather than desperate beginnings. 75 employees now worked under the Constellation Tech banner, their collective brilliance guided by Gabriella's unwavering vision. Standing at the head of the conference table in her sleek meeting room, Gabriella adjusted the cuffs of her tailored blazer, a far cry from the thrift store blouses of her early days. At 31, she carried herself with quiet authority, the hardships of her past visible only in the determined set of her jaw and the careful way she allocated resources, never taking prosperity for granted. "The Q3 projections show continued growth in healthcare applications," she explained to her executive team, gesturing toward the holographic display. "Our ethical AI framework is outperforming traditional models by 27% in predictive accuracy." Behind her, through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawled in all its ambitious glory. Somewhere in that skyline stood the penthouse where Michael had once told her she didn't belong in his world. Now she commanded her own view of the city that had nearly broken her. Later that afternoon, Gabriella made her way to the special room she had created for the triplets, a bright, welcoming space where they could do homework after school while she worked. At 7 years old, the children displayed extraordinary abilities that sometimes left even Gabriella breathless. Aiden sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by advanced calculus worksheets. his small fingers manipulating equations meant for students twice his age. Amara's violin practice filled one corner with haunting melodies she composed herself, while Aaron designed intricate structures on a tablet, his spatial reasoning abilities already attracting attention from his teachers. "Mom, look," Aaron called, waving her over. "I designed a better way for people in wheelchairs to navigate subway stations." Gabriella examined his work, genuine amazement overtaking maternal pride. "This is brilliant, Aaron. Have you considered how it would work during peak hours?" He nodded eagerly, pulling up another screen. Each child had inherited Michael's startling blue eyes, but behind those eyes lived compassion and creativity that their father had never possessed. Qualities Gabriella had nurtured through bedtime stories about changing the world through innovation and kindness. The peaceful afternoon shattered with the buzz of her intercom. Helen, her executive assistant, spoke with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Ms. Johnson, I apologize for the interruption, but representatives from Harrison Enterprises are here for the 2 o'clock meeting." Gabriella froze, the name hitting her like a physical blow. She had known this meeting was on the calendar. Harrison Enterprises was exploring acquisition of ethical AI technology to modernize their financial systems, but she had deliberately distanced herself from the details, leaving the preliminary discussions to her development team. "Harrison Enterprises," she repeated, buying time as her heart rate stabilized. "Yes, of course. I'll be with them in 5 minutes." She turned to the children's supervisor, an NYU graduate student named Tara. "I need to handle this meeting personally. Can you make sure they finish their projects?" In the private bathroom adjoining her office, Gabriella studied her reflection. The woman who stared back bore little resemblance to the frightened, pregnant girl Michael had discarded. Her dark hair fell in a sophisticated bob, her skin glowed with health, and her eyes held the confidence of someone who had built something consequential entirely on her own terms. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, a ritual from harder days that she had never abandoned. The conference room contained 3 Harrison Enterprises executives, all men in their 50s, with the polished, interchangeable look of longtime financial industry insiders. Michael himself was not present, a small mercy for which Gabriella felt oddly disappointed. Part of her had been preparing for that confrontation for 7 years. "Gentlemen," she greeted them with professional warmth, extending her hand. "Gabriella Johnson, founder and CEO of Constellation Tech." The lead executive, Charles Winfield, according to his badge, assessed her with the slightly surprised expression Gabriella had grown accustomed to, the look of someone who had expected someone older or perhaps male based on the company's reputation. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for meeting with us. Harrison Enterprises is interested in integrating ethical AI components into our risk assessment framework. Your system has shown remarkable results in healthcare and energy sectors." For the next hour, Gabriella guided them through Constellation's capabilities, carefully controlling the demonstration to reveal enough to impress but not enough to copy. The Harrison team asked increasingly technical questions, their initial condescension giving way to grudging respect. "Our preliminary offer would be $7 million for licensing rights," Winfield finally stated, sliding a folder across the table. Gabriella opened it, reviewed the figures, and closed it again with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's a starting point, but significantly below market value for proprietary technology of this caliber." $7 million is generous for a startup with limited financial sector experience," another executive countered. "Our valuation reflects proven results, not speculative potential," Gabriella replied evenly. "The price is $30 million, with ongoing support and customization." Winfield's eyebrows shot up. "That's excessive for unproven technology." "Unproven?" Gabriella pulled up a presentation on the room's display. "Last month, our system identified vulnerability patterns in 3 major trading platforms 12 hours before they experienced catastrophic failures. The firms using our pilot program avoided combined losses of over $2 billion. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed this information. "We'll need to discuss this with our board," Winfield finally conceded, gathering his materials. After they departed, Gabriella stood alone at her office window, watching Manhattan's afternoon light play across glass towers. Harrison Enterprises would decline her counteroffer. She was certain of it. Their interest had been in acquiring her technology cheaply, not valuing it properly. Michael's company remained trapped in old thinking, even as the financial world transformed around it. That evening, in her comfortable but modest apartment, Gabriella had resisted the trappings of extreme wealth despite her success. She sat at the dining table with the triplets, reviewing their school projects. "Mrs. Peterson wants to talk to you," Aiden mentioned casually, referencing their gifted program coordinator. "Oh? About what?" Gabriella looked up from helping Amara with her science project. The children exchanged glances before Aaron answered. "She says we need more challenging educational environments because we're operating significantly above grade level." The following afternoon, in a private meeting at the children's school, Mrs. Peterson leaned forward with an intensity that bordered on fervor. "Ms. Johnson, in 15 years of education, I've never encountered children like yours," she confessed. "Aiden's mathematical reasoning is comparable to graduate-level students. Amara's musical composition shows emotional depth that prodigies twice her age struggle to achieve, and Aaron's engineering intuition, designing accessibility solutions that professionals overlook, it's extraordinary." Pride swelled in Gabriella's chest, temporarily overwhelming the familiar anxiety about providing enough for their exceptional needs. "They're remarkable children. They're beyond remarkable," Mrs. Peterson insisted. "They need resources beyond what even our gifted program can provide." Later that week, a photographer from the New York Times arrived at Constellation Tech's offices. The business section was featuring an article on innovative companies led by women, and Gabriella's rising star had caught their attention. "Just a few more for the profile, Ms. Johnson," the photographer directed, adjusting her position against the Manhattan skyline. "The market is intrigued by your story." Gabriella posed professionally but with careful limits. "Focus on the technology and the company, please. My personal life remains private." She had deliberately kept her history with Michael out of all press coverage, not from shame but from a fierce desire to protect her children and maintain control over her narrative. The article would mention her as a single mother who had overcome personal obstacles, but nothing more specific. Across town, in the executive suite of Harrison Enterprises, Bradley Thornton, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, paused while reviewing the business section. His eyes narrowed at the photograph of Gabriella Johnson standing confidently before the Constellation Tech logo. "Wait," he murmured, recognition dawning. "Gabriella Johnson? Wasn't that the woman Michael was engaged to years ago?" He studied the image more carefully, remembering office gossip from 7 years earlier, something about a broken engagement with a Yale graduate. Looking at the accomplished CEO in the photograph, Bradley hesitated, then closed the newspaper without comment. Some observations were better kept to oneself, especially when they involved the private life of the company's heir. The photo of Gabriella in the New York Times, with its slight reference to overcoming personal obstacles, was far from revealing the whole truth. But in a few years, when Constellation Tech became one of the world's most valuable technology companies, Michael Harrison wouldn't need a newspaper to recognize the empire that could have been partly his. The photo of Gabriella in the New York Times, with its slight reference to overcoming personal obstacles, was far from revealing the whole truth. But in a few years, when Constellation Tech became one of the world's most valuable technology companies, Michael Harrison wouldn't need a newspaper to recognize the empire that could have been partly his. 3 years transformed Constellation Tech from a promising startup into an international powerhouse. The Manhattan headquarters now occupied the entirety of a sleek glass tower, its distinctive logo illuminating the skyline each night, a constellation of stars connected by lines, still reminiscent of the children's crayon drawing that had first adorned their Brooklyn office door. Gabriella stood at the window of her executive suite, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over New York. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something substantial against impossible odds. Her tailored Armani suit replaced the discount store clothes of her early days, her posture no longer bearing the weight of uncertainty. The intercom on her desk chimed softly. "Ms. Johnson, your car is ready. The children are already downstairs." "Thank you, Helen," she replied, gathering her belongings for the evening. In the private elevator descending from the top floor, Gabriella reviewed her mental checklist for the week: meetings with international partners in London, a keynote speech at a technology conference in Chicago, and Amara's violin recital on Thursday. The carefully calibrated balance of CEO and mother required constant vigilance. The triplets waited in the building's private lobby, now 10 years old and growing into their extraordinary potential. Aiden's head was bent over a tablet displaying complex equations, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Amara hummed softly, fingers mimicking violin fingerings on her thigh. Aaron sketched designs in a notebook, his spatial reasoning skills already attracting attention from university researchers. "Ready for dinner?" Gabriella asked, embracing each child in turn. Their penthouse apartment, spacious but deliberately not ostentatious, welcomed them with warm lighting and the aroma of the meal prepared by their part-time chef. Gabriella had insisted on regular family dinners, creating a sacred space where business calls were forbidden and conversations centered on the children's interests and discoveries. As they settled around the table, Aaron carefully arranged his napkin on his lap before looking up at his mother with Michael's blue eyes, though filled with a gentleness their father had never possessed. "Mom," he began, an unusual hesitation in his voice. "We learned about genealogy in science class today." Gabriella maintained her composure, though a flutter of anxiety rippled beneath her calm exterior. "That sounds interesting. What did you learn?" "About inherited traits and family trees," Amara continued, exchanging glances with her brothers. "Ms. Rodriguez had us start building our family trees as a project." Aiden, always the most direct, finally asked the question Gabriella had been preparing for years. "Mom, why do we never talk about our father?" The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken history. Gabriella set down her fork, choosing her words with characteristic care. "Your father decided he wasn't ready for a family," she began, her voice steady. "That was his choice, not a reflection on you." "But who is he?" Aaron pressed, his sensitive nature evident in the careful way he watched his mother's face. Gabriella took a deep breath. "He was someone I met at Yale. We were engaged briefly before I became pregnant with you three." "Did he die?" Amara asked softly. "No, sweetheart. He chose a different path. He decided that I, wasn't what he wanted in his life." Aaron's brow furrowed. "He never wanted to know us? Not even once?" The memory of Michael's cold dismissal threatened to surface, but Gabriella pushed it away. "He made his choice before you were born. And look at the path we've built together instead. Look how far we've come." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Gabriella sat alone on her terrace overlooking Central Park. The conversation had awakened memories she'd worked hard to compartmentalize. Michael's cruel words, the night spent in a subway station, the struggle to feed herself while pregnant. Success had not erased these memories but transformed them into fuel for her determination. The following morning, as Gabriella reviewed her schedule for the upcoming technology conference in Chicago, Helen entered with an unusual expression of concern. "I've just received the final speaker list and schedule for the Chicago event," her assistant said, placing the document on Gabriella's desk. "Michael Harrison of Harrison Enterprises will also be a keynote speaker tomorrow afternoon." Gabriella's hand froze over her coffee cup. In 10 years of building Constellation Tech, she had managed to avoid any direct encounter with Michael. She had seen his name occasionally in business publications, watched his company's gradual decline in relevance from a distance, but their paths had never physically crossed. "I see," she said finally, her voice betraying nothing of the sudden tumult beneath her composed exterior. "What time is his session scheduled?" 2:30, immediately following your keynote at 1 o'clock. Gabriella nodded slowly, mentally calculating. "Have the jet ready to depart immediately after my session ends. Tell them we need to return to New York promptly for an urgent meeting." At Chicago's Lakeside Convention Center the next day, Gabriella moved through the pre-conference networking breakfast with practiced ease, greeting industry leaders and accepting compliments on Constellation Tech's latest innovations. Her midnight blue suit projected confidence, her minimal jewelry deliberately understated, power that required no ostentatious display. From across the crowded atrium, she caught a glimpse of a familiar profile. Michael Harrison stood among a small group of financial technology executives, his posture still commanding though his hairline had receded slightly. Fine lines now framed the blue eyes that had once looked at her with such cold dismissal. He looked successful, but somehow diminished, a man holding his position rather than advancing. Gabriella felt an unexpected wave of emotion, not the hatred she might have expected, nor the lingering pain of rejection, but something more complex. She saw a man who had remained exactly who he had been, while she had transformed into someone he would never have imagined possible. Before he could notice her presence, Gabriella slipped away, instructing her team to ensure her movement through the conference center would not intersect with Harrison Enterprises representatives. Her keynote address received a standing ovation, her vision of ethical technology resonating with an industry increasingly concerned with the human impact of innovation. As soon as she concluded, her security team escorted her through a side exit to the waiting car, bypassing the reception where Michael would soon take the stage. On the private jet returning to New York, Gabriella gazed out the window at the clouds below, acknowledging the truth she had avoided confronting. Someday, the careful separation she had maintained between her present and her past would collapse. The world of elite business was too small, the circles of power too interconnected for permanent avoidance. 3 days later, as the triplets watched the evening news before dinner, a breaking story captured their attention. "Tragedy strikes prominent New York family," the anchor announced. "Edward and Margaret Harrison, leaders of Harrison Enterprises, have been killed in a helicopter accident en route to their Hampton estate. Their son, Michael Harrison, now assumes complete control of the family business empire." The screen filled with footage of the crash site, followed by images of the Harrison family at a recent charity event. Gabriella, entering the room with a stack of dinner plates, froze as Michael's face appeared on the screen. "Harrison," Aiden said thoughtfully, his analytical mind making connections. "That's not a very common surname, is it, Mom?" Gabriella set down the plates, forcing a casual smile. "New York has many important families with all sorts of names. Who wants pizza tonight? I thought we'd try that new place on Broadway." The distraction worked momentarily, but later that evening, as Gabriella stood alone on her terrace, she confronted the inevitable. The careful boundaries she had constructed between her past and present were beginning to dissolve. Michael Harrison, now the sole heir to his family's legacy, would be more visible than ever in the business world they both inhabited. "We can't run forever," she whispered to the glittering skyline. "Someday, we'll have to face the past." In her 10 years of meteoric rise, Gabriella had managed to build an empire while avoiding crossing paths with Michael Harrison, but fate had other plans. In the form of an invitation that would arrive soon to Manhattan's most prestigious charity gala, where they would finally be forced to occupy the same space, with 3 blue-eyed teenagers as unwitting witnesses. In her 10 years of meteoric rise, Gabriella had managed to build an empire while avoiding crossing paths with Michael Harrison, but fate had other plans, in the form of an invitation that would arrive soon to Manhattan's most prestigious charity gala, where they would finally be forced to occupy the same space, with 3 blue-eyed teenagers as unwitting witnesses. 5 years passed, like the blink of an eye. Gabriella stood on the private terrace of her office atop the Constellation Tower, watching the spring sunset paint Manhattan in hues of gold and amber. At 38, she had grown into her power with a grace that made her previous uncertainty seem like a distant memory. The company she had built from desperate midnight coding sessions in a Bronx apartment now employed over 4,000 people across 3 continents, with a valuation of $27 billion. Below her, 65 floors of innovation hummed with activity even as the workday ended. The building itself had become an architectural landmark, its distinctive silhouette featuring the Constellation logo that had begun as a children's crayon drawing 15 years ago. "The final copy for your Forbes interview is ready for approval," Helen said, entering the terrace with a tablet. In 12 years as Gabriella's executive assistant, Helen had become something between a confidant and a guardian, fiercely protective of her employer's time and privacy. Gabriella skimmed the article titled "The Visionary Decade: How Gabriella Johnson Transformed Technological Ethics." The writer had captured her professional journey without delving into the personal history she still kept carefully guarded. "It looks good," she approved, returning the tablet. "Any word from Aiden about the MIT presentation?" "He called while you were in the board meeting. It went exceptionally well. The quantum computing department is, and I quote, falling over themselves to have him join their accelerated program." Gabriella smiled with quiet pride. At 15, her son had been accepted into MIT's Special Advanced Placement program, his mathematical genius opening doors that typically remained closed until college. Amara and Aaron, equally extraordinary in their own domains, continued to exceed expectations in ways that sometimes left even their teachers speechless. "The invitation arrived this morning," Helen said, her tone shifting slightly as she handed Gabriella a heavy cream envelope embossed with gold lettering. "The Future of Innovation Gala at the Metropolitan Opera House. You've been named Forbes' most influential business leader of the decade. They want you as the keynote speaker." Gabriella ran her fingers over the embossed lettering, feeling a complex mixture of validation and wariness. The annual gala represented the pinnacle of New York's technological and financial elite, a world that had once seemed as distant as the stars. "They've also requested that the triplets attend," Helen continued. "Apparently, the event committee is intrigued by the next generation of innovation angle. It would be their first major public appearance together." Back in the penthouse that evening, Gabriella found the triplets already engaged in their typical afternoon activities. Despite their shared genetics, they had grown into distinctly different personalities united by extraordinary intelligence and the quiet confidence of children who had never doubted their mother's love. Aiden sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic projections of mathematical formulas, his fingers manipulating complex equations in midair. At 15, he had already published 2 papers on quantum computational theory that had senior mathematicians reconsidering fundamental assumptions. Across the room, Amara practiced a hauntingly beautiful violin piece of her own composition, her technique flawless despite the complexity of the music. Her recent neurological research on music's effect on brain development had attracted attention from leading scientists twice her age. Aaron, always the most socially conscious of the 3, was refining designs for an accessibility application that would help visually impaired users navigate urban environments. His national chess championship trophy sat almost forgotten on a shelf, just one of many accomplishments that seemed to come naturally to him. "The Future of Innovation Gala invited us all to attend," Gabriella announced, setting her bag down on the counter. "They'd like you 3 to introduce me before my keynote speech." The triplets exchanged glances, their silent communication as effective as spoken words after 15 years of constant companionship. "Will we wear formal attire?" Amara asked, lowering her violin. "I've been wanting an excuse to wear that midnight blue gown we saw at Bergdorf's." "I hope there's decent food," Aiden added pragmatically. "These events usually have those tiny hors d'oeuvres that leave you starving." Aaron, however, watched his mother's face with characteristic perception. This is a big deal, isn't it? Not just another industry event. Forbes named me the most influential business leader of the decade, Gabriella confirmed, unable to completely hide the pride in her voice. It's recognition of everything we've built together. Later that evening, a famous French designer arrived to discuss custom attire for the family's appearance. While the triplets excitedly reviewed fabric swatches and design sketches, Gabriella slipped away to her home office, momentarily overwhelmed by the symbolism of the upcoming event. 15 years ago, she had been ejected from Manhattan's elite circles, deemed unsuitable and common by the very world that now celebrated her vision. The invitation represented more than professional recognition. It was vindication of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment she had refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. The following week passed in a flurry of preparations. The triplets, excited about their first major public appearance, rehearsed their introductory remarks while Gabriella finalized her keynote address, a vision of technological ethics that had evolved from theoretical algorithm to global movement under her guidance. In the library of their penthouse, Aaron sat at a computer, researching the history of the gala for context to include in his remarks. His meticulous nature led him to explore archives of previous events, scrolling through photographs of past attendees. His fingers froze over the keyboard when a particular image appeared on screen, a society page photograph from 16 years earlier. The caption read, "Michael Harrison, heir to Harrison Enterprises, with fiancée Gabriella Johnson at the Metropolitan Winter Charity Ball." Aaron stared at the image of his mother, looking much younger and somewhat uncertain beside a handsome man with familiar blue eyes, the same eyes Aaron saw every time he looked in a mirror or at his siblings. Quickly, he checked the date against his own birth, calculating backward. The timing aligned perfectly with what little his mother had shared about their father. With growing certainty, Aaron pulled up more photographs, more articles, finally discovering an engagement announcement from the society pages just months before his mother would have discovered her pregnancy. He called his siblings into his room, closing the door quietly. "I think I've found our father," he said without preamble, turning the screen toward them. Aiden and Amara leaned forward, identical expressions of surprise crossing their faces as they recognized their own features reflected in the stranger beside their younger mother. "Michael Harrison," Aiden read, his analytical mind immediately connecting the name to the business empire they had occasionally heard mentioned. "Harrison Enterprises." "Should we tell Mom we know?" Amara asked, uncertainty in her voice. Aaron shook his head slowly. "She's never lied to us. She must have her reasons for not sharing his identity. Perhaps we should wait until after the gala." That same afternoon, Helen entered Gabriella's office with an unusual hesitation in her step. "The guest list for the gala has leaked online," she said carefully. "Harrison Enterprises has purchased a table." Gabriella paused briefly in reviewing her presentation, her hand momentarily stilling over the tablet. The name that had once held such power to wound her now registered as little more than a business competitor in decline. "It was inevitable that our paths would cross eventually," she replied with surprising serenity. "New York may be big, but the corporate world is small." What Helen didn't mention, and what Gabriella couldn't know, was that Michael Harrison would be personally attending. Since his parents' death in the helicopter crash 3 years earlier, he had taken complete control of the family company, struggling to maintain relevance in a market increasingly dominated by technological innovations, many developed by Constellation Tech. The night before the gala, Gabriella stood in her dressing room, observing the sapphire blue gown created exclusively for her. The color reminded her of the lights of Manhattan she had once gazed up at from the streets, homeless and pregnant, clutching her Yale diploma and $70. Now those same lights spread below her penthouse windows, no longer symbols of exclusion but the backdrop to a life built entirely on her own terms. In the dining room, she watched the triplets engaged in animated conversation about quantum computing applications. Their eyes, identical to Michael's in color but filled with warmth and intelligence he had never shown, caught the light as they laughed together. Tomorrow those eyes would be visible to the entire room at the Metropolitan Opera House, including the man who had never bothered to know the extraordinary children he had fathered. While Gabriella fastened her diamond necklace and prepared for the most important night of her public career, she couldn't imagine that tomorrow's headlines would celebrate not just her business success but a 15-year delayed confrontation that would leave all of Manhattan in shock. While Gabriella fastened her diamond necklace and prepared for the most important night of her public career, she couldn't imagine that tomorrow's headlines would celebrate not just her business success, but a 15-year delayed confrontation that would leave all of Manhattan in shock. The Metropolitan Opera House glowed with ethereal elegance, bathed in the blue and silver lights specially arranged for the Future of Innovation Gala. New York's elite streamed through the grand entrance, politicians in tailored tuxedos, celebrities draped in couture, corporate titans whose decisions shaped global markets. Among them, Michael Harrison moved with practiced confidence, though those who knew him well might have detected the subtle tension in his shoulders. At 42, Michael remained handsome, though fine lines now framed his eyes and a certain weariness had settled into his features, the look of a man maintaining a position rather than advancing. Since his parents' death 3 years earlier, Harrison Enterprises had lost market share consistently, its traditional financial approaches increasingly outdated in a tech-driven economy. "Another scotch, Mr. Harrison?" A server appeared at his elbow with impeccable timing. "Thank you," Michael nodded, exchanging his empty glass for a full one. He scanned the room, mentally cataloging potential investors and allies. This evening wasn't merely social for him. It represented a crucial networking opportunity for a company in need of fresh capital and connections. "Have you seen the speaker lineup?" asked Frederick Bennett, a banking executive whose family had done business with the Harrisons for generations. Michael checked his phone distractedly. "Some tech executive, isn't it? I've been focused on the Japanese investors attending tonight." "Not just any executive," Bennett replied with raised eyebrows. "Gabriella Johnson, the founder of Constellation Tech." Michael's hand froze midway to his lips, the name striking him like a physical blow. In 15 years, he had deliberately avoided learning anything substantive about her fate after their separation. He'd heard industry whispers about a revolutionary female entrepreneur, but had never connected those rumors to Gabriella, the woman whose engagement ring he had ripped from her finger the night he learned of her pregnancy. "Johnson is a common name," he managed, his voice suddenly hoarse. Bennett looked at him curiously. "The woman Forbes just named the most influential business leader of the decade. Her company is valued at $27 billion. Surely Harrison Enterprises has been tracking Constellation Tech's ethical AI systems?" Before Michael could respond, the lights dimmed and conversation faded as attendees moved toward their seats. Michael found himself inexplicably drawn toward the front, as if pulled by an invisible current. He settled into his chair just as the famous news anchor serving as MC approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor visionaries who are redefining our technological future." The anchor's voice resonated through the opera house. "But before we hear from the woman Forbes recently called the most influential business mind of the decade, we welcome 3 extraordinary young individuals, MIT prodigies, Aiden, Amara, and Aaron Johnson." The audience applauded as 3 teenagers walked confidently onto the stage. Michael's perfunctory clapping slowed, then stopped entirely as he stared at the young people now illuminated by spotlights. Tall, poised, with warm brown skin and striking blue eyes. His eyes, that seemed to pierce the darkness of the theater. The champagne flute slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was lost in the applause, but Michael remained frozen, his gaze locked on the 3 teenagers who were, unmistakably, his children. "Our mother taught us that technology without ethics is merely power without purpose," began Aiden, his articulation perfect, his presence commanding despite his youth. Michael stared at the boy's face. The shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, all hauntingly familiar from Michael's own adolescent photographs, yet with a confidence and purpose Michael hadn't developed until well into adulthood. "She built a company worth more than the 5 largest Wall Street banks combined," continued Amara, her graceful gestures reminiscent of a concert violinist, but never forgot that true value lies in human impact. The girl's poise was extraordinary, her intelligence evident in every carefully chosen word. Michael found himself leaning forward, straining to catalog every detail of the daughter he had never known existed. From a room in the Bronx to the Forbes 100, raising 3 children alone while revolutionizing global technology, Aaron concluded, his compassionate expression somehow the most unsettling to Michael. "It is with immense pride that we present our mother, Gabriella Johnson." The audience erupted in applause as Gabriella emerged onto the stage, a vision in sapphire blue that complemented her warm complexion perfectly. The frightened, pregnant young woman Michael had dismissed 15 years ago had transformed into someone regal, powerful, a woman whose very presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She embraced each of her children, his children, with evident pride and affection before approaching the microphone. Her eyes scanned the audience with practiced ease and for one paralyzing moment met Michael's. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, so brief he might have imagined it, followed by something that cut deeper than any hatred could have: complete indifference. She simply continued her scan of the room, as if he were just another face in the crowd. "Boston, Silicon Valley, and even Wall Street told me a single mother from Harlem would never build what we've created," Gabriella began, her voice strong and measured. "I believe we've proven them wrong." Michael barely registered the words of her 20-minute address on ethical technology and sustainable innovation. His mind reeled with the implications of what he was witnessing. Not only had Gabriella survived without him, she had thrived spectacularly. The triplets he had abandoned were clearly prodigies, recognized and celebrated. Her company was worth 6 times what Harrison Enterprises had been at its peak. The life he had deemed impossible for her had materialized beyond anyone's wildest expectations, and he had played no part in it. As the audience rose for a standing ovation at the conclusion of her speech, Michael remained seated, physically incapable of movement. The woman he had once deemed too common for Manhattan high society now stood confidently before the city's elite, receiving their adulation. During the reception that followed, Michael observed from a distance as CEOs, politicians, and celebrities lined up for a few moments of Gabriella's time. She moved through the crowd with elegant ease, laughing genuinely at a senator's joke, discussing quantum computing with a Nobel laureate, introducing her children to people who treated the teenagers with the respect usually reserved for accomplished adults. The triplets, equally at ease in this environment, conversed with world-renowned scientists and artists. Michael watched as Aiden explained a mathematical concept to a fascinated university president, Amara discussed neural pathways with a leading neurosurgeon, and Aaron engaged a tech billionaire in a passionate conversation about accessibility design. 3 whiskeys and countless agonizing observations later, Michael finally gathered the courage to approach Gabriella when she momentarily stepped away from the crowd toward a quieter area of the balcony. "Gabriella," his voice broke on her name. "We need to talk." She turned, studying him with calm, evaluative eyes, the gaze of someone assessing a business proposal rather than confronting a painful past. There was no hatred in her expression, which somehow felt worse. There was only clinical assessment, as if observing an artifact from another era. "Michael Harrison," she acknowledged with perfect composure. "What a surprise." "Are those—" He swallowed hard, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "Are those my children?" "No," she replied with surprising gentleness. "They're my children. You made that decision 15 years ago when you told me I wasn't enough for your world." Their conversation was interrupted by a silver-haired senator approaching with effusive praise for Gabriella's speech. Michael stood by, suddenly invisible, as she engaged animatedly in a discussion about ethical technology legislation. When the senator moved on, Michael tried again, desperation evident in his eyes. "Please, 5 minutes, in private." Something in his pleading expression made Gabriella nod briefly. They moved to a secluded balcony overlooking Lincoln Center, the spring night air cool against their skin. "You've built a technology empire worth more than Harrison Enterprises ever was," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Raised 3 brilliant children, turned rejection into strength, while I've merely inherited a legacy I'm watching crumble." "What do you want, Michael?" Gabriella asked directly, her tone businesslike. "To know them, please." His voice cracked. "They're my children too." For the first time, something like anger flashed across Gabriella's composed features. "Now they're your children? When they needed diapers at 3 in the morning, when Aiden had pneumonia at 2, when Amara cried from nightmares, when Aaron broke his arm falling from the monkey bars, where were you?" Michael had no answer. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "Your parents called me an unsuitable girl from Harlem the day you abandoned me," Gabriella continued, her voice controlled despite the emotion behind her words. "But today your grandchildren carry my surname, my values, and a future I built without needing the Harrison name." While the gala continued around them across the room, a New York Times reporter observed their intense conversation with professional interest, his experienced eye recognizing the tension that spoke of history deeper than business rivalry. By morning, the past that Michael had tried to bury would explode into public view, changing both their worlds irrevocably. While the gala continued around them across the room, a New York Times reporter observed their intense conversation with professional interest, his experienced eye recognizing the tension that spoke of history deeper than business rivalry. By morning, the past that Michael had tried to bury would explode into public view, changing both their worlds irrevocably. The first golden rays of dawn were just breaking over Manhattan when Gabriella's phone began to buzz incessantly. She had returned from the gala only 3 hours earlier, the confrontation with Michael leaving her more drained than she cared to admit. Reaching for her phone, she saw Helen's name flashing on the screen. "I'm sorry to call so early," Helen began without preamble, "but you need to see the New York Times immediately." Within minutes, Gabriella was staring at her tablet, scrolling through an extensive profile headlined, "From Abandonment to Empire, The Extraordinary Journey of Gabriella Johnson." The article detailed her rise from a pregnant homeless Yale graduate to billionaire CEO, explicitly mentioning her abandonment by a prominent Wall Street heir who had deemed her unsuitable for his world. Though Michael wasn't named directly, the descriptions left little doubt about his identity. "How did they get this information?" Gabriella asked when she called Helen back, her voice steady despite the shock. "Their reporter witnessed your conversation last night. Apparently he recognized Michael and connected some dots, then started digging." By mid-morning, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. Gabriella's phone vibrated with messages of support from colleagues and friends, many expressing astonishment at the revelation. The triplets, gathered in the living room, were unnaturally quiet as they scrolled through the coverage on their devices. "We already knew," Aaron admitted when Gabriella finally addressed them. "I found an old engagement announcement while researching for the gala. We decided not to say anything until afterward." Across town, Michael Harrison's world was imploding. The stock price of Harrison Enterprises had plummeted 7% within hours of the market opening, investors questioning both his character and judgment. His executive team had convened an emergency meeting to discuss reputation management strategies. Worse still, his phone displayed a dozen missed calls from Charlotte Ashford, the socialite from a prominent Manhattan family to whom he had proposed 3 months earlier. When he finally returned her call, her voice was glacial. "I've had reporters camped outside my parents' house all morning, Michael. How could you never mention this?" "Charlotte, please. It was 15 years ago. You abandoned your pregnant fiancée, left her homeless, never acknowledged your children, Brilliant children by all accounts. And you never thought this was worth mentioning before I accepted your ring?" The call ended with Charlotte declaring their engagement irreparably terminated due to irreconcilable differences in values. By afternoon, the jewelry box containing her returned engagement ring sat on Michael's desk, a painful echo of the ring he had once torn from Gabriella's finger. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage, Michael contacted his legal team. "I want to know my options regarding paternity rights," he demanded. "Those are my children too." His longtime attorney's discomfort was evident even through the phone. "We can pursue DNA testing and potentially petition for visitation rights, though given the circumstances and the children's ages, the court would heavily weigh their preferences." "Draft the papers," Michael instructed. "I've lost 15 years already." The following day, Gabriella received a formal legal letter requesting DNA testing and asserting Michael's intention to establish a relationship with his biological children. Her response came within hours, not a legal document, but a simple email containing a scanned image of the check Michael had written her the night he expelled her from his apartment. Across the digital image, her message was concise. "You relinquished all rights when this was your only offer of support." In the penthouse that evening, Gabriella gathered the triplets for a difficult conversation. "Michael Harrison has requested legal recognition as your father," she explained calmly. "I need you to know that whatever you decide, I will support you." The three teenagers exchanged glances before Aiden spoke first, his analytical mind addressing the situation with characteristic precision. "Statistically speaking, our lives have been exceptional without his participation. I see no compelling reason to alter that dynamic now." Amara tucked her legs beneath her on the sofa. "I'm curious about genetic inheritance patterns, of course. It would explain certain physiological traits. But beyond scientific interest, I feel no emotional pull toward a biological connection that has never been a relational one." Aaron, always the most compassionate, frowned thoughtfully. "Perhaps we should meet him once, for closure, if nothing else, to understand the person who contributed to our genetic makeup, even if he contributed nothing to our upbringing." Gabriella nodded, her throat tight with pride at their maturity. "This is your history as much as mine. I trust your judgment completely." After considerable discussion, the triplets decided to grant Michael a single meeting. They chose neutral ground, a quiet cafe near MIT, where they were all attending summer programs. Michael arrived an hour early, nervously arranging and rearranging the family photo albums he'd brought to show the heritage of the Harrison family. When the triplets walked in together, the impact was physical. Three extraordinary young people who shared his eyes but none of his uncertainty. They moved with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their worth or belonging. The conversation was polite but distant. Michael stumbled through awkward explanations of his past decisions, each justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I was young, immature, pressured by family expectations," he offered lamely. Amara's gaze was cool and assessing. "Our mother was 23 when she had us, alone, without a wealthy family's support network. What was your excuse again?" Michael had no answer. "I've calculated that your current net worth is approximately 1/27th of our mother's," Aiden commented, pulling out a tablet to display comparative corporate performance graphs. "Statistically interesting how trajectories can diverge based on fundamental ethical decisions." For an hour, Michael attempted to bridge 15 years of absence, his desperation growing as he sensed the unmovable distance between them. They were polite, articulate, and completely self-contained, requiring nothing from him, not even his acknowledgement. As they prepared to leave, Aaron offered the only small comfort. "Genetically, we are partially yours. That's a scientific fact we can't deny. But family is something else entirely." Michael made one final desperate attempt. "I can make up for lost time. I can leave half of Harrison Enterprises to you. It's your birthright." The three exchanged glances before Aaron responded gently, "Thank you, but we don't need it. Each of us already holds equity in Constellation Tech worth more than your entire company." In the months that followed, Michael observed from a distance the empire he could have shared. He sent expensive gifts that were politely returned. He attempted contact through intermediaries, only to be met with courteous but firm boundaries. Finally, after a particularly persistent attempt to arrange another meeting, he received an email from Gabriella. "Michael, there is no hatred in my heart for you. This may be difficult to believe, but it's true. The abandonment that once destroyed me eventually freed me to build something greater than I ever imagined possible. Our children are exceptional adults not because you left nor despite it, but simply because they are who they are. They don't need your money, influence, or name. They already have complete identities. If they ever choose to have you in their lives, I will respect that decision. But stop trying to buy a place that can only be earned with something you never offered: consistent presence. You didn't just lose a wife that day, Michael. You lost the chance to be part of the extraordinary family that flourished precisely because you weren't there to tell us we weren't enough. I sincerely wish you peace. Gabriella." In his office overlooking a declining empire, Michael Harrison finally confronted the devastating truth. His greatest mistake wasn't just losing Gabriella and his children, it was failing to recognize the extraordinary value of what he had held in his hands. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, Gabriella visited the Triplets on MIT's campus. Together, they walked along the Charles River, talking animatedly about the future. She didn't look back, no longer carrying the weight of abandonment. She had built not just a technology empire, but a complete and fulfilling life, the true revenge against those who had judged her insufficient. The lights of Boston twinkled on the water like stars, no longer distant and unreachable, but simply part of the scenery of an extraordinary life she had created on her own terms. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.